You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Amy Pryor, Technical Director at the Thames Estuary Partnership. Welcome back to Talk of the Thames. In today's episode, we'll be talking about climate change, what impacts we can expect in London and beyond, and our hopes for a good outcome from COP26. This was recorded in late October before COP26 took place, and we'll be following up in later episodes as plans unfold for the next round, including the UN Ocean Conference and COP27 in 2022. I'm joined today by Kristen Guida, London Climate Change Partnership Manager at the Greater London Authority. Hi Kristen, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hi, and it's really nice to be here. Thank you. So I'm Kristen Guida. I run the London Climate Change Partnership. So I manage this partnership of organizations across all different sectors and all across London who are interested in the issues around adapting to climate change. So I'm hosted within the Greater London Authority, so I'm employed by the Greater London Authority, but my role is a lot more outward facing. It's about coordinating and supporting kind of partnership working and knowledge exchange and stuff to kind of promote adaptation. That is thinking about the impacts of climate change on us, as climate change is actually, already starting to happen. We're seeing the impacts already. So it's about the effects that climate change are going to have on the city and how we then manage those. And then practically that can mean, in terms of the activities that we do, it can mean everything from identifying the right stakeholders and experts to join discussions about policy or programs or things like that. It could be just setting agendas for meetings or trying to think through what some of the problems are, right through to just booking meeting rooms and ordering coffee. I mean, it's everything from, trying to think and anything that can help to generate productive and useful conversations that can help people manage those impacts.
That sounds fantastic. How long has the London Climate Change Partnership been in existence for?
The partnership has been around for a really long time. I think it started in around 1999. I think it might, or around 2000. So it was a little bit before my time here in London, let alone the UK. But I think that's one of the strengths of this partnership, because it is this sort of cross-sectoral partnership that also outlasts kind of, political terms and systems. And so it's got that kind of dedication from people who are, either interested in or responsible for preparing London for the impacts of climate change. Wow.
Okay. So that's really forward thinking, wasn't it? From starting in 1999.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It feels like the Greater London Authority has been sort of ahead of the game in terms of really thinking about it and planning for the future. Definitely. I think London's been quite proactive in that sense. I think, back in those days around, 1999 or 2000, we were really starting to come to grips a bit more with climate change projections. And I think, there was already, a lot of knowledge about the fact that we need to decarbonize, we need to reduce our impacts on the environment and on the climate. But we were actually just starting to see climate projections coming through that are telling us a little bit more about what we can expect into the future. And at that time, there were partnerships. There was a partnership in the Southeast, and London, I think, was the second one. I know this just because I used to run the Southeast Climate Change Partnership before I came to London. And they all kind of started out really with a sort of an assessment of what those climate projections meant for that area of the country. So looking across, business, academia, the health sector, infrastructure, the natural environment, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that was kind of the beginning of it, is saying, right, so we know we need to decarbonize, but what do these climate projections mean for us and across the different sectors of the functions of our places? So does the partnership, is the partnership involved in action planning for the city? Does it directly influence the mayoral policies?
Definitely. I think, we can act in a few different ways. I mean, first of all, as a person on staff, I can sort of keep abreast of what's going on, we can definitely feed into the strategies like the London Environment Strategy, which contains an entire chapter on adaptation. So that sets out the sort of policies and proposals that London is promoting effectively to help us adapt to climate change. And the partnership can do a few things. I mean, number one, we can bring in expertise to kind of look at all that and provide advice and suggestions about what kinds of things work and what kinds of things don't work, about what's happened already. And we can also, I think what we've also done over the years is help to provide some of the evidence base for that. So making the links between the scientific research and academia, and the sort of policy and practice that can use that research and academia to make better decisions. So things like, our understanding about heat risk across the city, and some of the interesting research that's gone on around that, and understanding the urban heat island and vulnerability to climate change impacts has informed some of the policy. So, we can be involved in all sorts of different ways.
That's fantastic. It's so important to have evidence-based policies, isn't it, to know that we're making the right steps towards being as adaptive as possible, given the constraints of the city.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there one of the key things, the heat risk that's going to be apparent and even more apparent in the years to come. Can you quickly run us through the headlines of how climate change is going to really affect the city and what the partnership recommendations are for adapting to those risks?
Broadly, we're looking at three kind of major risks from climate change in terms of like the hazards. So heat risk, we've got flooding risk here in London, and that's like 5 different types of flooding. People maybe don't quite realize that, but we've got, flooding from rainfall, flooding from rivers, tidal flooding, I think sewer flooding and groundwater flooding, if those are the 5. And, it matters because, there may be some sort of common ways that we're going to manage those risks, but we do have to look at them for what they are, really. And then the third is obviously water scarcity. We are in the southeast of England. We're in one of the most water-stressed regions of the world, actually, when you look at everything, including our, populations and stuff like that, and the development and population that we're expecting into the future. So those are the 3 kind of major things that we're expecting, and that we're already starting to see. I mean, we already know that we've been in, it's not so long since we've been in drought periods. It's not so long since we've seen impacts from heat. And of course, I mean, we saw quite a lot of surface water flooding we had 2 major incidents, I think, in July this year, and then a bit more in September. So we're seeing this happen, and we're seeing it happen in other places as well. We're seeing, really grim effects of, for example, surface water flooding in Germany, in America, and all over the place. So in London, I think we've been relatively lucky in that we haven't really seen loss of life in these kinds of storms like other countries and cities did. But I think we need not to, be complacent about it and look at it as though we're somehow, that's just not going to happen to us. I think we've been lucky. We've been really lucky so far. And these are the kinds of things we need to look at. Of course, climate change and the way it's going to affect us isn't just about the natural hazard. It's not just about the stuff that falls from the sky. It's also about how vulnerable our systems and our people are. So, thinking about, the exposure. So we have, information about properties exposed to surface water flood risk, for example. We're able to kind of put together the data and map that and understand, where we have issues with rainfall collecting, once it falls in big, huge amounts from the sky. We also know that, certain social vulnerabilities also make people particularly vulnerable to climate change. So things like poverty and deprivation, underlying health impacts, age, your ability to speak English in this country, for example, these are, social isolation. These are things that will make people particularly vulnerable to, for example, heat waves. Like, we know that social networks and social isolation are a big determinant of whether you will survive a heat wave, for example.
Yeah.
We know that, we've also seen that COVID impacts, don't hit people equally or fairly. And similar with climate change impacts. And we sometimes see that, for example, some of the impacts from health on people are similar, or there are some of the risk factors are similar. So we have to consider, the fairness of the impacts, but we also have to consider how we target our responses as well. We have to make sure that, we're not locking in problems or creating solutions that aren't necessarily going to help, the people who most need it. So those are all kinds of things we need to think about.
That's fascinating. It's the pandemic has certainly been an eye-opener, hasn't it, to really bring to light some of the social inequalities and how that really does have an impact, or can be impacted by these external events that we have no individual control over.
Absolutely.
And I think it's probably one of the areas that a lot of people, including myself, had never thought about before, as to, you tend to think about the external and the natural hazards, but all of the socioeconomics are just intrinsically linked with the external environment and our impact on that. So it's such a big, complex concept to get across. And when you're trying to distill that complexity down into its simplest form, so you can communicate to every range of people that we have within the city, given the huge diversity in the city and the huge diversity of language, it's really, that must be feel like an insurmountable feat sometimes.
Yeah, I think trying to focus down, on what we can do and what we can do kind of in a practical way is always a challenge. But you're right. I mean, I think, having to try to communicate these things across different communities and with different sectors and things, it can be really difficult. But I think that's part of why we have a partnership.
Yeah.
And I think the partnership, one thing I can say about this is that we don't necessarily see ourselves as being public facing. I think a lot of our partners potentially are, and we want to work with those partners to help them engage with their communities in a more effective way around this particular issue. So, if we, similarly with, small businesses, for example, we know we're not going to be able to reach out to every small business and tell them about, how to get insurance and find ways of protecting yourselves. But we know that we have partners who are more, working more in that space. So the more we can work through kind of well-linked organizations to try to get the messages out and across, the better, I think.
Oh, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, the power of partnership really comes into its own when everybody utilises that shared message across their networks. That's something we're very passionate about within the Thames Estuary Partnership.
Of course, yeah.
So you've mentioned some of the solutions that we have to think about. In practical terms, can you give us a couple of examples of the kinds of solutions that the partnership is thinking about in terms of heat risk and rainfall and surface water flooding? Those seem to be two really key things for London in particular.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting work going on around this in London, so to look at or to try to address issues around heat, for example, or surface water flooding. I mean, partners are doing some really interesting things. So let's see, for example, we have our London's tidal flood risk management strategy, which is quite famous, the Thames Estuary 2100 project that's led by the Environment Agency. Yeah. And I think, that's there to just, kind of protect London from the tidal flood risk. And it includes the Thames tidal defenses and the barrier that's, the quite famous iconic structure. It also includes things like, trying to promote the boroughs that are actually on the river to create resilient strategies to deal with that kind of flooding. And the Environment Agency has been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years to update that strategy, the T2100 plan. And get really good buy-in across different stakeholders because they can't manage the risk completely by themselves. So that's, one thing that's going on. Let's see what else has been going on. I think, in response to the to the surface water flood risk that we've recently seen, the mayor convened a round table. He got some press around that, but the mayor has very little power to actually manage surface water flood risk. We're not a flood risk management authority. But what we can do is, convene stakeholders and try to put pressure on them and try to sort of collect up an understanding of what needs to happen. We can lobby government, that kind of stuff. And so he brought together a roundtable that has, included a lot of the key partners, the water companies, the resilience people, the Environment Agency, the boroughs, and so forth. And, to try to work out, well, let's see, what went wrong with that flooding, with those two flooding incidents, and what went well, and how do we learn from those events. And so that's kind of had two major strands to it. One is kind of the immediate emergency response, and the London Resilience Partnership did a very rapid debrief on it, the kind of immediate response to the incident and the preparations and that sort of thing, and have come up with about 30 recommendations for how to improve response in the future. Getting partners communicating better with one another, people achieving better situational awareness, and those types of things. To deal with some of the longer term issues, like the adaptation, and thinking about some of the issues that make it more difficult to manage surface water flood risk, we've also set up a group to look at some of those issues, governance being one of those issues. This is why I said the different types of flood risk are slightly different from one another. So tidal flood risk, we have some sort of clear responsibilities. With surface water, rainwater flood risk, we've got boroughs are flood authorities and they need to do certain things. Thames Water owns, some of the infrastructure. We have the Environment Agency that kind of has an oversight role on all of this. And then we have people that provide funding, and government provides funding. But there's nothing really like organizing all of this at a kind of like a larger strategic level. There's no sort of coherent plan across things. So we're kind of looking at how we can potentially address that issue. But in terms of some of the more kind of concrete examples of things you can do, in terms of surface water flooding, sustainable drainage, we call it SUDS, sustainable urban drainage systems. But ideally, that's like incorporating more green space into urban areas, green space that can kind of soak up water so that it's not like running off into the sewers or flooding people's homes, but also potentially provides other benefits like, it looks nicer. It can potentially provide cool spaces for people. It's, can potentially be helpful in terms of things like air quality, can also help a lot with water quality. So these types of natural interventions that can have multiple benefits for, a lot of different reasons can be quite good. And those are the types of things we like to try to encourage.
That's lovely. Yes, we work with a lot of the Rivers Trusts and other organisations across London that are looking at not only river restoration, but how can we have more integrated, what we would call green-blue infrastructure, which to, the layperson, that just means a mixture of green space and blue space, i.e. rivers, and including the Tidal Thames. So that flow of water, if we remember that the Tidal Thames sits in the bottom of essentially a big river basin, like a big bowl, all that water is running downhill towards the Tidal Thames. So anything that comes down through those rivers is going to eventually end up in the Tidal Thames and ultimately out into the global ocean after quite a period of time. But it's all so connected that we need to be emulating nature in that way and connecting up our green and blue and trying to adapt our grey infrastructure, such as buildings and, more formal hidden infrastructure like the sewage treatment works and whatnot, so that it works together and can cope into the future with the expected increased, heavier, shorter bursts of rainfall, where we're going to see a lot of water fall in a shorter space of time than we're used to.
Yeah, well, and I think you raise a really interesting point there too. It's like you say, this is all, water is all heading downward eventually into the same place. It's all going that way. And I think this kind of highlights again why a partnership approach and a coherent strategic approach is necessary, because you could say, well, we could, we can put up a flood defense in front of, a tube station and try to keep that tube station from flooding. But actually, does it make more sense to try to manage that water upstream further? Do you know what I mean? Like, because we know that sometimes when we talked about SUDs, sustainable urban drainage systems, the thing about that is that in order to best manage risk over here, it might not be the best place to put the SUDs in that same place. It might be better to put it somewhere else and to manage that risk, closer to where it becomes a risk.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
Working across these different areas is really important because, everything is connected, like you say.
And because of the large scale of the city, that's 33 boroughs within the Greater London Authority area.
Yeah.
As you say, those upstream interventions are really important for slowing down the flow of water, taking the water as much as possible at every stage in its journey from the top of what we would call the catchment right down into the Tidal Thames. There's interventions that need to happen at every stage of its journey, and that appropriateness, what intervention goes where, right place at the right time, right organisation to deliver the right level of work. That takes a partnership approach and that strategic umbrella overview, so that all the parties underneath have a direction of travel and the best evidence-led advice.
Absolutely, yeah. And hopefully, if we can achieve some sort of a vision or a plan. I mean, that's the other thing, is a vision for what is good in this space. I think is not something that we've ever really come to any agreement on, So I think different organizations and different, have their own views about that potentially, but there is no sort of cross London kind of view of that, of, what is it we're all planning for? What is good and resilient look like? Something that I think TfL said after the flooding incidents, when they appeared before the London Assembly Environment Committee, was actually, we did lose a lot of tube stations that were out of commission during those floods.
Oh, wow.
But in fact, they bounced back quite quickly. So there is a question there, for us to all ask ourselves, is that good enough? Do we accept a certain level of disruption and say, well, that's kind of just what this all means? Or do we say, actually, we never ever want to see that happen again, and and we have to expect 100% service 100% of the time, or is it something in between? I mean, these are all, and I'm not being in any way like rhetorical there. It's a legitimate question that we need to be asking ourselves, and I think water companies will be asking themselves that, and others will as well. So there's something there about understanding what looks good enough and what level of risk are we willing to just accept. And so it's important to have that kind of vision. I think, as it doesn't have to be massively intricate and detailed, but I think something that we can all look to and see, this is what we're kind of expecting. And then this idea of, then how do we get that strategic, coherent overview of what's going on, where we are in relation to that vision, and what will help us get, to fill the space in between. So that's all, to me, that seems like something that we should be aiming for. But then I think once you have that, there's also a question of the powers and the authority to deliver that. And that's, of course, another challenge, I suppose. But we'll get through these somehow, I think.
Well, in some ways, it's a bit of the sort of pressure from lots of angles, isn't there? Because there's the speed with which things are happening and the impacts are being felt and have been felt for a long time, but they're getting worse as time goes on. And the individual's sort of understanding of what's happening and their willingness to actually adapt to a different kind of way of living, possibly, and a different way of working, which, again, I think there were so many lessons learned through the pandemic around how we can operate as a society when ultimately we were isolated for months at a time. And in my mind, it might sound a bit doomsday, but, there's an uncertainty around, well, what is life going to look like in a climate with changing climate in the next 20 years? What does it mean to live in the city with these kinds of impacts, and how is it going to impact me as an individual in my life and my work? And those are really hard questions because no one's got a definitive answer. We can only take the kinds of indicative or the indications of what some of these impacts might look like in the future, and what we can do to mitigate, but also how we are going to have to adapt as a society to basically be more comfortable with living with water, I would imagine.
Oh, definitely. I think you allude to something important there, and that's how kind of local adaptation is. I mean, like you say, we can get kind of a bird's eye view of kind of what the impacts will be. We can say sort of across London that we're going to see more floods, we're going to see more storms, we're going to see more heat and all of that. But every individual system is going to see a different type of impact. It will have its own kind of exposure and its own vulnerability in different ways. And so part of my job is to try to help organizations and, organizations in whatever way you want to define that, to understand what that all means for them.
Yeah.
So in Lambeth, that might mean, certain particular issues, and it might be slightly different in Southwark or somewhere else. It's helping people to kind of do that assessment for themselves in whatever way works for them. And we can provide evidence. So, the GLA, has a lot of really great evidence on the data store that anyone can find about our flood risk and potentially heat risk. We've also done some really good climate risk mapping that looks at not just the sort of the hazards, the flooding and the heat, but also the social vulnerability indicators.
Oh, fantastic.
And that is, potentially helpful in terms of, starting that conversation, hopefully, at local levels, but also just targeting projects and programs to try to locate and understand, where the most vulnerable people potentially are and why they're vulnerable, and what we can do potentially to help support those people.
Oh, that just sounds brilliant. It's all the work you're doing is just so urgently needed, and it's a really critical role. So I'm very pleased we have you in the position to help pull everybody together and help us all collectively navigate the future. So I'm just going to take us on to talking about the big event that's happening over the next couple of weeks in Glasgow, the UNFCCC COP26. So for some of our listeners, they might not have actually heard about COP26. They might not know what it is. Mm-hmm. Can you explain to us a little bit what is COP26 and why is it important that we all take note of what's happening?
Yeah, just an easy one there. So COP26. Well, this is the UN's, like you said, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is their annual climate change conference that's being held this time in Glasgow. It's delayed because it was not held last year when it was supposed to. And this is for the signatories of the UNFCCC, around 190 something, 97, 98 countries, I think. And so we are expecting, I think, in Glasgow, probably tens of thousands of delegates, including, country and city leaders and their staff and, other diplomats and activists and all sorts of people. And the purpose of COP26 sort of broadly is to set new targets for cutting our greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay.
To try to keep us within the 1.5 degree global temperature limit and, prevent catastrophic warming. And that 1.5 degree centigrade global temperature limit was kind of agreed after the sort of Paris Agreement, which we know about from a few COPs ago. And then some further research that sort of said, well, Paris tried to keep us within 2 degrees. And then, kind of further research came out saying we really need to stick to about 1.5. So we need to be getting better commitments to try to keep us within 1.5 degrees to prevent catastrophic warming. But we also need, and this is more kind of on my side of things, stronger commitments by wealthy countries to be providing financial support to help poorer countries adapt to the impacts of climate change and to help insulate themselves from the costs of the transition to a low carbon economy as well. So again, this is an issue of fairness and an issue of justice. Absolutely. You have a lot of countries, you have a few countries that, very industrialized countries that have contributed the most to this problem. And yet we are not the ones who are going to be the worst or most immediately affected. You have countries and people within those countries that are poorer, that are, have exposed coastlines, that are, have economies that are potentially, at a much greater risk. And so there is a huge call here for the wealthy countries to be basically just providing money to support adaptation in those places. And I think it's really important because we've already reached 1 degree. So we were saying we need to stick to 1.5 degrees. We're not starting from zero. We reached 1 degree of a few years ago, and we're already seeing the impacts of that, like we were saying before. So we have more frequent severe extreme weather all over the world, and that's just like the climate models have projected. This is not anything that should be surprising. And we've seen those floods, like we said, in Germany, New York, and here in London. Also things like wildfires, in the US and elsewhere, and, record temperatures like in the Arctic, which are really frightening, I think. So we know that climate change is also going to continue for a few decades, even after we stop emissions.
Yeah.
So the effect of decarbonization, even if we can achieve that, is not instant. So we still have inevitable climate change that we need to deal with. Yeah. And so, the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's, the world's leading scientists. It's the best science that we have, kind of by consensus. That tells us that we have less than 10 years to cut emissions to stay within that 1.5 degree limit. And, some of the changes that we're going to need will take years to implement, probably. Yeah. So a lot of experts see this as this COP26 as like the last real chance to commit to meaningful emissions reductions. But the country commitments are just not really adequate. And even the big promises are far from being kept. I mean, we saw the Climate Change Committee's report come out in June, sort of, looking at our progress effectively in dealing with climate change. And, they highlighted this here in the UK, that, we have great promises on climate change, mitigation, or that is decarbonization, but those are not being kept. And we don't even have the promises properly in place around adaptation or dealing with the impacts.
Given the level of change that's required to happen, some may think it sounds really radical what has to happen to remain within 1.5 degrees. But at the end of the day, it's not actually about saving the planet, as a lot of people seem to think. It's about ensuring the survivability of human society. And that sounds really melodramatic, but that is actually what we are facing. We're a species, just like any other animal on the face of this planet, and we can only survive within certain temperature parameters and external conditions. Without those, we're done for, which, that's the kind of thought that keeps me awake at night sometimes, thinking our species survival is what we are all trying to work towards. And until that's taken seriously and the targets that are set are actually met, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve to avoid catastrophic heat temperatures and all the other effects that go along hand in hand with that.
You're absolutely right. It's about the future of our species and all of the other species on this planet, many of which we've already wiped out. And if you don't care about that, then, there's plenty of other evidence about the economic impacts of climate change. A lot of people talking about it is a huge economic issue. The costs of not dealing with climate change from an economic perspective are going to far outweigh the costs of just dealing with it now. But we're not very good at long-term thinking as a species. We're not, I think, and this isn't really, I think, your question really, because this kind of gets more into the why can't we just get a grip on this? But I do think, we're not very good at thinking longer term. And it's, we see the rain outside, we do see the floods and stuff like that, but we kind of for the most part think, oh yeah, well, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and I'm still going to go to work and all that kind of stuff. And maybe people just don't really see the urgency. Then again, maybe it's just not completely down to people. But there's also this argument about the economy and all it's going to mean for the economy. So, there's that we can care about. There's public health. There are all sorts of public health arguments. There are all sorts of arguments around nature, and all sorts of arguments about the ability of our infrastructure and our convenience and how we're going to cope. What argument, I'm asking you, Amy, what argument is going to make the difference? Because, I think it's a really interesting. It is so urgent. And I think the other point that I always like to try to remember to make is that, it is our species, but it's always going to be the most vulnerable and the people who have the least sort of coping capacity that are going to be hit first.
I know, yeah, it's so sad, isn't it? And I think part of the problem as well is that I think people understand that there are other more vulnerable communities elsewhere, not here in the UK. But actually, our most vulnerable communities in the UK are our coastal communities, all around. I can't remember which report it was either, but I recently read there's been quite a lot of press recently off the back of Professor Chris Whitty's recommendations in his health report on health, calling for a dedicated coastal strategy, because some of the worst health indicators are in our coastal communities all around the country. And I think what some people don't realise, or a lot of people don't realise, is that our most deprived communities within London tend to be riverside boroughs. And there's a lot of similarities between our coastal communities elsewhere within the UK and our deprived communities within London, not just because of that juxtaposition with the estuary, which is part of the global ocean, but also, the way with all the inequalities that they are suffering through deprivation, they're still going to be worst hit within the London context, as you said earlier, by all the impacts that we're going to feel in the city from climate change. So there's a huge amount of learning and knowledge exchange that could happen on a domestic level around coastal communities that London can learn from, and vice versa, probably. But then there's also a huge amount we can learn, I think, from within the UK, from how those communities globally are looking to adapt in their own local context. The best arguments are going to be different for each individual person, because it really comes down to, what do you value?
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your values, if that's family and friends, think about their health. Think about, their future life. Think about the unborn children in your family. What are their lives going to be like in 50 years' time, 100 years' time? And equally, if it's nature, then think about how nature is going to be impacted and how that's going to have a knock-on effect on you, because all the services that nature gives us, we're going to have less of that, including our own health and well-being. And if it's economy, like you said, the bill's going to be bigger if we don't spend the money now. It's going to cost a huge more amount of money in the future, and there's going to have to be, if we wait till absolute crunch point to put some of these adaptations in place, the price of that's going to skyrocket, and also it's going to have to be more drastic because we've waited until the crisis got worse. And like you said, it's some of these things are just locked in now. It's like a speeding train, isn't it? That we're trying to put on the brakes, but instead of doing a hard brake, which will not stop the train anyway, it would slow it down faster. We're sort of tapping the brake and then allowing the train to build up speed all of that time. So as an analogy, I think of that all the time, thinking it's going to take decades for the train to slow down and stop. So we have to hit the brakes now, spend the money, and agree to that more radical adaptation, if you like. Sounds like a word I shouldn't use, radical, but it really does we need to change radically. But that requires leadership, right? So the world leaders need to show that leadership, and COP26 is the moment for that leadership to shine.
Definitely. And I think, you make a really good point, because it is about, you talk about, what are the things that are meaningful to people, and getting people to take action can really depend on that. What do you value and all of that? But I do think, you kind of point to an interesting question there about who can do what here. And I think this is big across the adaptation and mitigation agendas. It's just it's who are we communicating about this to? Who are we trying to make the case to, and why? How much, as a householder or as an individual person, there are certain things you can potentially do, try to, don't have your important stuff in the basement, I don't know, if you can make changes to your home, your property, then maybe you can, install some shading and that type of stuff. And similarly, I think with, emissions reduction, people can stop flying, or they can stop eating meat, and they can do all that kind of stuff. But let's be serious here. I mean, it is the leadership that has to take charge of this. It is political leaders, and also kind of industrial and business leaders, and innovators. And I feel like, this is my own kind of hobby horse, I suppose, but this idea that, we all have to do our bit. It's just if we all just do a little bit, it'll really help, I think, is quite a dangerous and insidious idea that has been promoted, I think, by the fossil fuel companies to try to deflect the responsibility from themselves. And I don't begrudge anyone who wants to do things a bit more sustainably. I myself have pretty much stopped eating meat, not completely. I try to be careful about what I'm doing, recycle, all those kinds of things. We all try and do a little bit, but that isn't going to stop this problem. No. And I think when I'm out in front of a group of people giving a presentation, I very frequently, one of the questions that I get asked is, well, what can I do? What more can I do? And at this point, my answer is not an awful lot, probably, but write to your MP or write to your congressman, tell them you care about this, because they eventually, you would hope that they would listen to that. But maybe I'm straying slightly off topic a little bit.
No, not at all. I think that's a really important point, because there's a difference between feeling like anybody who's worried and a bit like me about the future, and it's waking them up in the middle of the night sometimes. It's important to have a few individual things that you feel is contributing to the global collective effort to reduce our carbon emissions. And in that sense, I think that is very important, to feel like you have at least some agency and some control in the face of this really big global problem that ultimately you as an individual can't solve.
Absolutely.
But that kind of public power and that public pressure on our industrial leaders and our political leaders to take it seriously and to listen to the people on the ground, what they want, the more people that lend their voice to those types of movements, and as you say, write to their MPs, write to their congressmen, write to whoever their local leader is. It could be a faith leader, it could be a different type of community leader, to advocate on your behalf. That has a huge amount of power. And it's kind of, I don't know what the right phrase is, but, people like to, certainly industrial leaders like to talk about, the power of the consumer. If the consumer speaks by not flying and not buying meat and, demanding different things of the market, then the market will deliver that. But I think that's a double-edged sword, because, you get an awful lot of products out now that claim sustainable credentials, but when you dig down deep into what they're actually doing, which vast majority of people don't have time to do, you'll often find that a lot of what they're saying is really greenwashing, is what we would call it. It's paying lip service to what's trendy, if you like, at the moment, rather than actually adequately becoming sustainable or trying to. And we have the tools, we have the technology, we have the brains to certainly achieve that. And I think it really ultimately, like we said, comes down to the political will and leadership to get it done. Having said that, the mayor will be going to COP26, presumably. Is he going?
Yeah. I think he's going quite soon. For the earlier bits. Yeah.
And does he meet with other mayoral leaders from around the world?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've got Yeah, definitely through, well, there's the C40 Cities initiative. So that's like a big global initiative that's been around for a number of years now, that brings cities together to share knowledge and information.
Oh, brilliant.
And so we at sort of officer levels participate in that. And there are some really great networks, looking at things like heat risk or flood risk or those types of things, and sharing a lot of information on equity and social justice and things like that. But the mayor has just taken over the chairmanship of the C40
Oh,
cities.
fantastic.
Yeah, so that's just happened. I think that gets announced soon. Well, I guess he officially takes over.
Okay.
Sometime soon in the next week or so. So I think he's been extremely committed, I think, to this issue in general. And so we're quite proud of that.
Yeah, he's been fantastic. We've, as part of the #OneLess campaign that we were part of, led by the Zoological Society of London, they did a huge amount of advocacy with the mayoral office, and managed to secure the mayor's commitment to installing water fountains all across London to try and reduce the use of single-use plastic water bottles. So that's just one example of the kind of commitment and leadership he's showing. And I was involved in the evidence in public rounds for the draft London plan, and I thought it was a fantastic piece of work, because all of those strategies that sit within the London plan are all integrated and cross-connected, and it's that kind of thinking and leadership that needs to happen across the board, going back to what we were talking about with the need for these kinds of strategies and aligned messaging and thinking. I think he's shown real leadership in taking that forward for London, so he'll be a great chair.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, that's the other thing with regard to our stuff that we do in terms of the adaptation to climate change. I mean, it's not just an environmental issue. And I think what you're saying kind of alludes to that. So the London plan, London's big spatial strategy that for development is one of the few, I think, really strong powers that the mayor has to actually affect some of this stuff. I mean, he's not like mayors of some other cities who have just, loads more actual powers and even, more massive budgets and things like that. So we do have a few particular levers, and the London plan being one. And so, we've definitely in our team fought for kind of good, strong policies within the London plan. So to deal with managing overheating, for example, in new development through, a cooling hierarchy that says, first of all, just design the building properly, orient the building properly so that you can prevent the overheating before you have to get to the, the last resort, which is, stuff like air conditioning. But there are lots of steps you can take before that. And similarly with, trying to deal with flooding and those types of things. So part of what we've tried to do is to incorporate adaptive measures and plans and strategies into other mayoral strategies. So the London plan, the transport strategy, the resilience strategy, the food strategy. I mean, we've got, and I think that's one really great way that, people here have been able to work together to try to, just make sure that things are as well integrated as we can possibly make them, like you pointed out with the London plan. So yeah, pleased that people find that, find that a good example. I think we do pretty well.
I think so. I'm a fan.
Still more to do, though. There's always lots more to do.
There's always lots more to do. Yes, well, I think, we do all have a part to play, but what I'm hoping for is those real solid commitments that will be seen through, and seeing evidence that they're going to be seen through in the aftermath of COP26, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, if we can raise adaptation up the agenda and get, even our own government to put resource into tackling that problem, because it's a real and present, problem with the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. To do that, not only with a commitment to the developing world, but also here, I think that will be a really good outcome.
Estuaries tend to get forgotten and left out of the loop a little bit. But they're such important waterways, particularly in this context as well, because obviously in the Thames we're going to be seeing not just the flooding effect, but with rising temperatures, the water temperature rises. So our biodiversity, some of the certainly commercial fish species, for example, that our local commercial fishermen in the bottom of the Thames Estuary rely on, those species will be changing because they will move. They will move to where they are more comfortable. So there's all sorts of hidden impacts that people just aren't going to see because, the Thames is brown, naturally, should be brown, with all that lovely sediment in it. Makes it one of our biodiverse aquatic habitats. So we're going to be, we're thinking about that and what that might mean for local economies, for local communities, and really thinking about how we can, through things like the London Climate Change Partnership, how we can help to join the dots across our human society, but also our natural world within the estuary, and how that might impact or help with the global ocean issues as well. So there's lots to do, as ever, lots of conversations to have, but I think the most important point is we're all willing to work together collaboratively to really, ensure the best possible outcome that we can for not just the Thames and the City of London, but also the world and us as a human species. So let's carry on the discussions, helping each other out and asking for help when we need it. And I think we have a good chance of getting there.
I hope so. I really do. But that is one of the great things about, I think, working in this area and in this field is that you do tend to be working with people who are committed and who have, interesting and good ideas and working across different sectors like I do and like you do with the Estuary Partnership. It's always great to hear about different perspectives and different ideas that can help you solve your own problems, which is just what it's all about, really.
Willing to learn, willing to listen, willing to replicate good practice. Absolutely.
And try stuff and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right?
Oh, totally. Yes. No, I'm a big fan of that. We need to be experimental and innovative and increasingly, certainly as the main fundraiser in Thames Estuary Partnership, I do talk to funders a lot about how it would be lovely if we could get projects funded that are pilots, that are testing and trialing different approaches when we can't guarantee that it's going to have the outcome that we predict. So, a lot of funds, you have to basically be sure and to describe exactly what you're going to get at the end of it. And I think increasingly we've just got to get out of that box and look at how can we fund things fairly and across things like integrating across social, environmental and economic issues because they're all linked together. So there's innovations that can benefit issues and challenges in each of those different types of those different sectors. So, if we work together and we, try and be a bit more experimental, more innovative, and just work more, be happier working with uncertainty to see what comes out. I think that's...
Absolutely. I mean, I really think that's like huge. And I think you're right. I mean, I do think we have to kind of get away from kind of saying like, if, that failure is always failure, I mean, in some cases we just have to learn. We just have to do stuff that we can to learn. And I think that's something that people need to value a little bit more. And it's quite difficult. The other thing I think is just, I mean, you and I are both in I think a really good position in the sense that we both run partnerships which means that obviously someone values a partnership approach. And there are so few, I think, and I've had other partnership related, colleagues and stakeholders and partners who will say the same thing. I mean, it can be really difficult to get people to value just the coordination function of a partnership, like your role or my role, because people always want to fund shiny, exciting outcomes and things like that. The people who bring the people together, set the agendas, get the coffee, book the meeting rooms, get the sandwiches and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. That's necessary. Like if you just have a bunch of partners that say, oh yeah, we're just going to have a partnership and we're all going to work together, but it'll just be like each of us will just contribute a little bit to that. it doesn't work. You actually have to have a dedicated resource. And this is something I bang on about all the time. And so do a couple other people, because
I do too.
without that dedicated actual resource, or the person to help bring the people together and to help do some of the thinking and to help take away some of the actions and get stuff happening, this stuff doesn't work. And there used to be 9 climate change partnerships across England when we had regions, like back when we had, administrative regions. London is the only one left because London still values that kind of a role. The rest of them disappeared in around, 2015. And that's because there's just, people don't value that. And so therefore it doesn't get funded, and the Climate Change Committee has recognized that repeatedly in its progress reports and said, we used to have these support mechanisms and no one's funding that anymore. And it's a difficult one because it's a bit of a market failure. It's the sort of thing that I think sort of does have to be funded publicly, because we're not going to get much of a return on investment for this kind of work. But, if it doesn't get recognized, it's never going to happen. And I'm hoping that, at some point the tide will turn a little bit back and say, right, we do actually need to value this kind of coordination and partnership working, because it's the only way to get a coordinated, strategically coherent approach to this issue, that where we're not all like working in silos and doing things piecemeal. We're actually coordinating, as understanding the landscape, understanding the scale of the progress that's going on and the activity that's going on, and what's needed.
Couldn't agree more. You're preaching to the choir, Kristen.
Yeah,
no, it is a very difficult thing to fund. Yes, that core partnership convening role, because ultimately, I think it's not just external funders; it's also government funding streams and any kind of, like, as you said, market-linked funding stream. Corporate social responsibility needs to really does need to recognise that the actual human capital, and that's just as much value as the return on investment that they might have at the end of it. I think it's possibly a bit of a tenuous link, but it's a little bit like what we were talking about in terms of paying the money now to do the adaptation so that we don't have to pay more money in the future. The partnership convening role is a bit like that. You spend the money now and you do the strategy now, which it sounds less sexy and it takes a long time. It's very difficult, herding everybody towards meeting dates and setting agendas and agreeing targets. But once you've done that, once you put the investment in, which is actually a small amount of an investment in terms of the kinds of budgets you hear about, across all different sectors, that saves you time in the long run, and it brings people together in a collaborative way with that single, point of contact to someone like you or me for certain, action groups that I run. And it's such an important role. Without it just wouldn't happen.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing is, you get, like you say, it doesn't really get valued, but also, when it does, it's often in, year-long time slices. So, you get funding for a year, but you don't know if you're going to exist after that. I mean, for us, that's an issue because adaptation is a longer-term problem.
Yes.
And sometimes it takes, people a couple of years just to get their heads fully around what they need to be doing in this space. So it's, having this constant insecurity of, when you're constantly having to plan for your own closure effectively, it's not a great start in terms of trying to plan for, adaptation into the future. So I think, like you say, we're preaching to the converted, but maybe there's someone out there listening to this who will, be able to do something with that information.
No, absolutely. I hope everybody's listening to the key messages in this. It's the same across the third sector, really. Any kind of conservation role, for example, or environmental role, you tend to have to work to 12-month timescales. And when you're working in a place like an estuary or a coastal setting, for example, you're not going to be able to pull together the money, the people, the plans to do the kind of restoration work, for example, on a tidal on a tidal river such as the Thames, that's like 10, 15 years in the planning system to get anything like that off the ground. And you're talking millions of pounds. That's not going to be achieved in 12 months. So inevitably, I'm constantly writing funding proposals for support this staff role so that in 10 years' time, we can get this outcome. And some people get it and some people don't. So it's, you have to work with what you have, but, as a human, as an individual as well, it's very stressful working in a role where you don't actually know whether your role's going to be there in 12 months' time, because you have to pay your bills just like everybody else, and you have that work-life balance, and that kind of level of uncertainty all the time is very stressful. I know because I've had it myself in the past.
Same, yeah. I'm so lucky. Sorry. I'm so lucky now that I think London really values that and has, so I'm here, which is really helpful. But like I said, other colleagues that I have who run other partnerships have so much stress over that and spending so much time writing like funding proposals when you could actually be doing
the job.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you so much. I think I'm trying to think of like a really nice positive that we can end on, and I think I'm going to go back to that sense of, even though we know that the impacts of climate change could be catastrophic. It's a very depressing and big complicated issue, but I think over the next 2 weeks we're going to see a huge amount of people power and good conversations happening at all levels of society in those thousands of people descending on COP, and then hopefully thousands more that will be accessing the information virtually. And at least, in the very least, it'll create good conversations and possible connections with those that we might not have thought to talk with before, and might lead to even more lessons learned and things that we can pull into our work on adaptation and mitigation locally in London. So I'd like to say good luck to the mayor. I hope he has some great conversations with the other leaders from coastal cities around the world, such as London. And thank you so much for spending so much time with me today. It was fascinating.
Yes, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's fun to be here. And yeah, good luck with all the rest of your COP26 activities.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Talk of the Thames. It was brilliant to chat to Kristen, who's so knowledgeable across the complex subject of climate change, and I hope you enjoyed listening at home. We'll be back next month with a brand new episode, so please do follow and subscribe to be notified every time we release a new episode. Until next time, take care and bye for now.